Who is for peace? The longer title would be Who is for peace and who is for war? This is the title which we've given it here, and which we're going to give it in a book which is coming out in September, of which this will be included. But originally, I think it's worthwhile telling you something of the history of this lecture. Originally, the basis of it, it's been enlarged as it now exists, and I'll give it to you this afternoon. But originally it was given on June 22nd of last year in the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. And there was a long list of the host committee, many government men, George Will, many other people. There were a lot of congressmen there, senators, people in the administration. The title at that time was The Secular Humanist Worldview versus the Christian Worldview and the Biblical Perspectives on Military Preparedness. It was this double title. It was given then. A number of people have seen it. It's been summarized in some places, but never been published in full. And then this autumn, Nelson Company is bringing out a book called Who is for Peace, and it will contain an answer by James Hitchcock, who is a professor on St. Louis University, a Roman Catholic university, a Roman Catholic professor of history, who's written a very fine book on humanism, and he's writing an answer to the Roman Catholic bishops. And then there is a Soviet dissident who will have a section, and it'll come out as a small book about the same size as the Gandhi book, which is in the bookstore here, in the same sort of format, and we're hoping to see it released in September. So that is the history of this lecture. The theme of this essay or lecture may at first appear to be a double one, but actually these two halves are not in conflict. As we shall see, they make one unity: the secular humanist worldview versus the Christian worldview, and the biblical perspectives on military preparedness. First of all, we must be very careful to define what we mean by humanism. By humanism, we're not talking about humanitarianism. I just say in passing, I think some Christians have been very confused in not keeping these three words I'm dealing with separate and clearly defined. By humanism, we're not talking about humanitarianism. Humanitarianism means being kind to people. And as Christians, we should be humanitarian even more than anyone else. We must be equally careful not to bring into confusion the difference between humanism and the humanities. A study of the humanities is a study of human creativity, often related to classical learning, that is for the Greeks and the Romans, but also the whole of human creativity. And I would say it should include properly an interest in the creativity by Christians and also by non-Christians. And as such, Christians above everyone else should be interested in the humanities. I'd say again, often I think Christian education in Christian schools has been greatly lacking in the interest in the humanities, the arts, music, and so on, as an exhibition of human creativity. Many of my books, films, etc., deal with a Christian consideration of the humanities, being thankful for the creativity, which is a natural part of man, spelled out with a capital M, because people are made in the image of God. As a bracket here, I would say my emphasis on the priorities, which I gave last year at the Labri mini-conferences, emphasized the fact that if we're going to have real Christian education and protect it from the inroads of the state, it must be good education, and that means we should really have an interest in the humanities, of true creativity across the board. And we know why people are creative, and the world around us does not know why man is creative and the animals are not, which is the case. But we know why people are creative and show creativity, and that is because all people are made in the image of God. Then we must ask what humanism is, which we must contrast with great clarity to the Christian worldview. We must realize that the contrasts go back to two different views of final reality. What is final reality? The Judeo-Christian worldview, the final reality, is the infinite personal God who is truly there objectively, whether we think he is there or not. He is not there just because we think he is there. He is there objectively. He is the creator. He is the creator of everything else. And we must never forget that one of the distinguishing marks of the Judeo-Christian God is that not everything is the same to him. He has a character. And some things conform to his character, and some things conflict with that character. To this God, in contrast to Buddhism and Hinduism, for example, not everything is the same. And therefore, there are absolutes, right and wrong, in the world. As we come to the other side, to the final reality, which is being taught in our schools, public schools, and which is much of the framework of the thinking and writing of our day, the final reality is thought of as material energy, which has existed forever in some form, and which has its present configuration by pure chance. The real issue is the question of final reality. The difference lies in what the final reality is. Either the infinite personal God to whom not everything is the same, or merely material or energy which is impersonal, totally neutral to any value system or any interest in man as man. In this view, the final reality gives no value system, no basis for law, and no basis for man as unique and important. Beginning about 80 years ago in the United States, we began to move from a Judeo-Christian consensus or a Judeo-Christian ethos in this country to a humanist consensus, and has come to a special climax in the last 40 years. For anyone who is 50 years of age or more here in this room, the whole dramatic shift in this country has come in your lifetime. Something to be very sober about. The whole dramatic shift has come in your lifetime. I'll add something here. The first signs of it, of course, was among the intellectuals, such as Oliver Wendell Holmes. And 101 years ago, he made his tremendous statement, the man is no different from the grain of sand or the baboon. 101 years ago, it began to come into the intellectual fields. Think of John Dewey, education, for example. About 80 years, it began to enter into the general scene. And in the last 40 years, it has come to a tremendous climax in law, in every other area. So those of us who are here, who are 40 years of age and under, it has come 40 years of age, pardon me, and as we consider that, we must realize that the entire change has come in our lifetime, if we're that age. That brings a very sober thought, of course, as to responsibility for allowing this to overcome the consensus and the ethos as we have. And today we must say with tears that largely the consensus in our country and in the Western world is no longer Judeo-Christian, but the general consensus is humanist, with this proper definition of humanist, with its idea that the fixed reality is only material energy which has existed forever, shaped into its present form by chance. There is no value system at all from that final reality. No one has said it better than Jacques Monod, the Nobel Prize winner in biology, a Frenchman, who wrote a book some years ago which was very popular at the time called Chance and Necessity. His view is that this is the final reality. He holds this view for himself. This is his view. And then he laid down very firmly that with this view there is no way to determine the ought from the is. That's his own words. that if we live in this silent universe, which is totally silent to any value system, any intrinsic value to man, any basis for law, if that's what the final reality is, we must realize there is no way to tell the ought from the is. From what exists, we have no guidelines. Totally, totally silent universe. On this basis, therefore, man must make himself the measure of all things. Do understand this. It's not a fluke that it's turned out this way. If there's no value system anywhere else, or any basis for law, or anything out there somehow that gives an intrinsic value to man, then man must make himself the measure of all things. And man has. The things that have come into our country which have troubled us are only the inevitable results of this worldview. I've said in other lectures that Christians have thought too much in bits and pieces. They're troubled by this, they're troubled by that, they're troubled by the other thing. But what they don't realize is these things are all symptoms of a single basic problem, and that is, what is the worldview? What is the final reality? And the fact that we are, by law, taught in our public schools, not allowed to teach anything else. The final reality is only the silent universe. This being so, therefore, of course there's a lack of value systems. Of course, therefore, there's no basis for law. You only have sociological law. It couldn't be any other way because there's no value system from anywhere else to give it. So humanism, rightly defined as the man is the measure of all things, which is the definition of the Enlightenment, actually. It was their own definition of humanism. That this isn't the first step. The first step is the wrong final reality, and then that's all the possibility there is. Man must be the measure of all things. He must be the measure of all things in every area. If you hold this worldview, you must realize there is no source of knowledge except what man can find for himself. All revelation is ruled out. First thing is not morals. The first thing is knowledge. There's no source of knowledge except a relativistic knowledge. And that's all, because man is the measure of all things, and it is only what man discovers for himself empirically that then is knowledge. All revelation, all other kinds of knowledge is shut out. Therefore, knowledge never can be certain. The dilemma of what your youngsters and you who are younger are wrestling with is not, first of all, value systems, but no knowledge today can be certain. And there can be no value system except that which is totally arbitrary. This view leaves us with no final value system, and therefore with only personal, arbitrary, relative values. That's personal value system. It isn't only Fletcher who teaches situational ethics today. It is the general concept that we find on the basis of this view of the final reality. And more serious than the personal arbitrary value systems is the fact that it leaves us only with arbitrary law. There is no basis for law. Law becomes only the decision of a small group of people, and what they decide at that given moment is for the good of society. And that is all. Because the final reality gives no clue as to what law should be, and is left up to a group of people, the Supreme Court, or whoever they are, to make their own decision as to what is good for society at the moment. So there are relative personal values, and there is arbitrary law, and there is also a loss of any intrinsic value to the individual person. This is the reason that today in this country we accept which have been an abomination just 11 years ago. And that is abortion growing on into a fanticide, the killing of babies after they're born if they do not come up to someone's standard of a value of life worthy to be lived, and on into the drift toward the euthanasia of the aged. This is all a natural result, a mathematical certainty, of the acceptance of this other view concerning final reality, and the lowering, therefore, of any view of human life. In their view, the final reality has nothing to say about any real value, any unique value of human life. In our country, this shows itself in many ways. but it most clearly shows itself in the syndrome of abortion leading to infanticide, leading to the euthanasia of the aged. When Dr. C. Everett Koop, my son Frankie, and I worked on Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and we began to talk about infanticide, people really thought we were very extreme and out in left field. But now it has been declared legal. In the case in Indiana, where the baby, the Down syndrome child, was allowed to die on the basis of the parents' wishes. When Whatever Happened to the Human Race came out, people thought we were extreme to say infanticide would soon follow. Now it is before us on every side. And the euthanasia of the aged will also come with speed. If you think this is extreme, think back on the change from abortion to infanticide and with what speed that came. What is involved is not only a loss of the baby that is killed, but is a loss increasingly of the whole view of the unique value of any human life. It is also, therefore, the loss of compassion. The compassion this country never has had enough of, but for which it has been somewhat known, will not stand if we continue to go down this humanistic road, because there is no real value for people intrinsically, and as such, it is not only the babies that can be killed by abortion and infanticide, but there is no real reason for compassion toward other people, any other people. Think of Oliver Wendell Holmes' words 101 years ago. Man is no different from the grain of sand or the baboon. I would plead with those of you who are here, your responsibility as citizens, and if anyone is in government specifically, not to allow other things to sidetrack you as to the need to stand against this downplaying of the value of human life. Many things might distract you, but you must realize, for those who are Christians especially, that there is an absolutely unbreakable link between the existence of the infinite personal God of the Bible and the unique value of human life. No one could say anything more important to understand our day. There is a total, unbreakable link between the existence of the infinite personal God of the Bible and the value, unique value, to human life. Remove the first, and there is no basis whatsoever for a unique, intrinsic value to human life. These things are irrevocably linked. They're irrevocably linked. And if you allow the unique value of human life to be played down legally, as it's being done in this country, and last week with the new Supreme Court ruling was played down further, as it is at the present time in this country, not only does it lead on to other things such as the euthanasia of the aged, but the whole basis of compassion is lost. For those of you who think this is a small issue that should be swept under the rug, I plead with you to think again of the fact of how crucial and central this issue is. This is a vital issue for which the Judeo-Christian final reality gives us the answer. And we are losing it in our country, in our culture, in our law, in our schools with great speed. It is where humanism in medicine and law have come together at the point of human life, and it naturally favors abortion. And equally, it has no way to put any emphasis on the value of human life when we consider it politically in other countries. That's a bridge into the second half of the lecture. The First Amendment in this country, which has been stood on its head, how careful you must be to comprehend this. This is thrown into our teeth by Civil Liberties Union, by the people we talk to all the time. People don't understand that the concept of the First Amendment has been totally stood on its head. The First Amendment, when it was passed, was that there should be no state church for the 13 colonies, and the state should never interfere with the free expression of religion. Those two things and nothing else. They didn't want a state church like the church in Britain or Sweden or someplace, a total state church for the whole all the 13 colonies. Most people don't realize, though, that almost all the individual states at that time had their own special relationship to special denominations, and that even that was not considered contrary to the First Amendment. I would repeat, the First Amendment had only two purposes: that there would be no state church for the whole 13 colonies, and secondly, that the state should not interfere into the things of religion. Of course, now it has been completely turned over. Today it has been turned over by the Humanistic Society, the Civil Liberties Union, and so on. And the First Amendment is made to say the very opposite. That is, that Christian values are isolated from the governmental process. Jefferson's always quoted here. But Mr. Jefferson, as they still call him, at the University of Virginia, would have rebelled against this concept. Absolutely rebelled. It didn't enter in at all into his thinking. I won't go into it here, but it's quite demonstrable. I'm not saying he was a Christian. That's a different sentence. But he understood and acted upon this freedom of religion, uncluttered by the government. And that indeed it is the very opposite. It's turned on its head to slide over and make the First Amendment say that religion, notice I'm saying religion, not Christianity, religion should have no part in the governmental processes. The principles shouldn't be brought in. I stressed in my previous talk, of course, we're against a theocracy, etc., but nevertheless, it's very different from what's made of it today by the Civil Liberties Union, trying to cut away religion from the governmental processes. I don't mean as a formal organized religion, but Christian principles brought in contact with the governmental process. This simply was not the meaning of the First Amendment, and the meaning of it has been stolen from us and stolen from the Founding Fathers' concept that wanted real freedom of religion, uncluttered by the state's interference. The terror is that in the last 40 years, increasingly government, and especially the courts, have been the vehicle to force this other worldview on the total population. It is the government that has done this by its laws and court rulings. The public school system is the clearest example, but not the only one. It's become the vehicle. The state has become the vehicle to force this other worldview upon the total population and especially upon the children. The very opposite of the meaning of the First Amendment. It is the government which has become a vehicle to force this on the total population, this other worldview, and especially in the public schools. We find as we look at this country that we have now a largely humanistic consensus or ethos, a humanistic culture, a humanistic society. But happily we do not yet have a totally humanistic consensus or culture. Happily, not a total one, though we're far down the road in certain areas. It isn't total. We still have the Christian memory, although it is moving with titanic speed. Now, this being so, our calling is clear. It is that we who hold the Christian worldview, we who love human life, we who love humanity, should stand fast for the honor of God. But we should also stand fast so that humanness will not be lost. It's humanness that increasingly is being lost. Why not? There's no final value, intrinsic value, if you hold this to human life. And humanness isn't in line with the what isness or what is in this other view. So it is lost. And then we must say with sobriety that the United States does not have a manifold destiny. Let me now move to the other side. The United States does not have a manifold destiny. Consequently, if we continue to insist on walking down this road, at some point, as God is God and not all things are the same to God, We who have trampled so completely on all those amazing things that God has given us in this country, can we expect that God does not care? If we say he exists, he is a person, not all things are the same to him. Do you think he doesn't care to what we're doing in this country, in the whole Western world, but this country, as we walk upon the gifts that he has given us? So we must not feel that we're only playing intellectual and political games. If this God exists, and not all things are the same to him, we must realize as we read through the Scriptures that those who trample upon the great gifts of God one day will know his judgment. And we must not take that lightly. We must not take that lightly. Now, moving on to the second part of the lecture. The first part of our topic was the secular humanistic worldview versus the Christian worldview, and I have dealt largely with my own country back here in the United States. The second half is, quote, the biblical perspectives on military preparedness, end of quote. This is related to what I have just been speaking about above. They are not really two divergent subjects at all. You must realize that the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc and all the Marx, Engels, Lenin communism, all of it also has as its base that the final reality is only material energy shaped by pure chance. Just say that communism doesn't refer primarily to economics. It's almost incidental. Almost incidental. Communism basically is dialectical materialism. Materialism, that the world, that all the reality is only material or energy shaped by pure chance. That's the very heart of Marx, Engels, Lenin communism. This is the central thing. The economics of Marxianism really is not that which is central. As I've said, it is dialectical materialism. You've heard that term, I'm sure, most of you all your life. Dialectical. And then comes the word, materialism. That doesn't mean just having your eyes at the moment fast on only material things. It means this worldview we're talking about. In other words, the final reality is only material energy shaped by chance, exactly the same thing that is a plague in our own country under the name of humanism. And that's why these are not two topics, they are one topic. Now, where does it end? It ends in the Marxist bloc, therefore, inevitably in a devaluation of human life. Inevitably, with mathematical certainty, in a devaluation of human life. As in our country, humanism leads to abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia, and a loss of compassion. This view of final reality does so more totally in the communist bloc because it is totally committed to this view. Totally committed to it as a state policy. Therefore, there is a total emphasis that there are no fixed values. There is a total emphasis that there is only arbitrary law. Frankie has fairly recently made a film called The Second American Revolution. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to get in your churches and so on and see it. It's the most clear thing I know of the slide that has come in our country in areas of law. The Second American Revolution. It is a powerful thing, and one of the people in the film who's portrayed as Stalin. And in that film, he says exactly what his own position was. Law was only what he arbitrarily set forth. Law was only what he arbitrarily set forth. That's all. Now, actually, you will notice that we have a parallel here to what is happening in our own country. But the difference is that in our country, it is not total. In these countries, it has become total. This idea of the final reality has come to its conclusion. So there is no fixed value, there is totally arbitrary law, and there is the total loss of the value of the individual person, and only the state has come to matter. There is an elite. which sets the laws, which says arbitrarily what the laws are, and which sets forth these things as arbitrary absolutes. They're absolute by law, but they're arbitrary absolutes. So we find in the Soviet bloc a natural direction toward an elite that has more total power in an arbitrary fashion than that of the old kings. The elite in the Soviet bloc is more total than the old kings. There is no final value system, and therefore we should not be surprised if they sign the Helsinki Accords and then go on and continue to persecute their own people without even a wink. Why should they not, with their own view? There's no absolute standard. Only the state matters, and the good of the state as they see it. We're totally naive if we're surprised that when it is convenient, the Helsinki Accords and any written agreements like them can be broken overnight for the good of the state. It's an interesting thing in regard to their abortion laws that when the Soviets first came to power, they made easy abortion laws. Later they found it was not helpful for the state, so overnight they changed them in the Soviet Union, and in the Soviet Union abortion became illegal. Later they changed them back again. A flip-flop with absolutely no problem. Why not? They're making arbitrary laws. We find that on the basis of their worldview, they have a low view of human life concerning the individual person. This takes two forms. First, internal. The operative word is internal. First, the internal oppression from Lenin onward, that is internal in their own country. Lenin wrote before he ever came to power that the reason that one of the early attempts of the revolution in France was not successful was that they had not killed enough people. He had put that in a book prior to his coming to power. And in regard to this consideration, we should remember that this year is the 50th anniversary of the enforced famine by Stalin, in which 8 to 10 million Ukrainians, their own people, and Cossacks were starved to death as a matter of state policy. They simply allowed 50 years ago 8 to 10 million of these people to starve to death for their own, what they considered a state policy. Not political one, but economic, actually, which makes it even worse, it seems to me. With their low view of human life, we cannot expect anything else. You must understand that oppression is not an incidental thing in their system. From Lenin onward, oppression was logical, on their own base, as an integral part of their system. Now that was internal to their own people. The second result is external, that is looking outside of their own country. The second result is external, expansion and then oppression. The second result is external expansion and then oppression. I beg you to understand that this is not a fluke of one moment of their history. It is also a part of the integral system which they hold. As naturally as humanism in our country leads to abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia of the aged, in the more total expression in the Soviet system, humanism, in quotes, humanism, leads to internal oppression and external expansion and oppression. I must say that I have one admiration for them. That is, from Lenin on, they have been, I think, the only country in the world that has had a consistent foreign policy. They have been totally consistent, unhappily so. Unhappily so. Tremendously consistent. We can think back to Latvia and Estonia. Poor Latvia and Estonia. They did not want to be overrun, but they were overrun. If you go to Finland, even today, where people have contacts with Latvia and Estonia, there is still sorrow because of this expansion and oppression in those countries. And there is a constant flow of oppression up to the immediate history of today, as we think of Afghanistan and Poland. This is as natural to the materialistic worldview as is abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia on this side of the Iron Curtain. Those of you who understand what is happening in our own country in regard to a lowering of standards in these areas ought to be able to understand what it means in communist countries where these concepts are total and there is total power to bring forth their natural results. Now, in the light of this natural expansion and oppression wherever they go, what should be our biblical perspectives on military preparedness? I would say from my study of the Scripture, to not do what can be done for those in the power of those who automatically and logically oppress is nothing less than a lack of Christian love. It is not loving my neighbor as myself. I do not need to appeal to, quote, natural law, those of you who know these discussions. I do not need to appeal in any way to natural law at this point. The Bible itself is clear. I am to love my neighbor as myself in the manner that is needed in a practical way in the midst of the fallen world at my point of history. To love my neighbor as myself can mean nothing less. This is why I'm not a pacifist. I'm not a pacifist because pacifism in this poor world in which we live, this lost world, means that we desert the people who need our greatest help. As an illustration, I'm walking down the street. I see a big burly man that is beating a little tot to death, beating this little girl, beating her. I come up and plead with him, do all I can, logically, urging him to stop. If he won't stop, what does love mean? Does love mean I just walk away? Love means I stop him in any way I can, including, quite frankly, as I see it, if I have to, as the last resort, and being sorrowful for it, hitting him. And to me, this is necessary Christian love in a fallen world. What about the little girl? If I desert the little girl to the boy, I have deserted the true meaning of Christian love and responsibility to my neighbor. We have in the last war the clearest illustration one could have with Hitler's terrorism. That is, in the last World War, there was no possible way to stop that awful terror that was occurring in Hitler's Germany except by the use of force. There was no way. In 1950, our family, Edith and I and our children, held a summer Bible school for military dependents in Dachau. It was at that time as it was during the war. It had not yet just become a museum as it is today if you went there. There were still living in that area Polish people who had been in the camp and would have gone to the ovens within 2 days if the American troops had not broken down a portion of the wall and then with their tank and then come in with their tanks and then shot their way in that camp. I shook these people by the hand. They would have been dead within 2 days if that had not occurred. As far as I'm concerned, this is the necessary outworking of Christian love in the world as it is. We wish it wasn't this way, but it is a fallen world, and this is the way it is. The world is an abnormal world because of the fall. It is not the way God had meant it to be. The world is not the way God meant it to be. It's like it is an abnormal world in many ways because of man's revolution against God. There are lots of things in this world which grieve us, and yet we must face and never act in a utopian manner. Utopianisms in this fallen world have always brought forth tragedy. That's all forms of utopianism. The Bible is not utopian. It's realistic about the fact that we live in a fallen world in all areas. The Bible is not utopian. Morality based upon the Bible and not upon a non-Christian romanticism demands that people have our prayer. But not only our prayer. It is biblical to say, as General Bernard Rogers, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe and a devoted Baptist, incidentally, has recently said, quote, to have nuclear weapons in order to deter their use from the other side, to protect your people, that is moral. But I think it is immoral for a nation that is charged with that responsibility not to have the capability to deter that kind of war. End of quote. We all grieve at any war. Christian that doesn't grieve a war, there's something the matter with him, just like we grieve at all the sorrows in the world. And we naturally grieve concerning the possibility of atomic war. But in a fallen world, there are many things we grieve at, yet nevertheless we must face. From the time of the last World War onward, it is the Europeans, people in government in Europe, more than the Americans, who have wanted the protection of atomic weapons and have demanded them. Concerning the present deployment of the United States Pershing II and cruise missiles in Western Europe, Helmut Schmidt said in a keynote speech at Times, that's Time Magazine's Atlantic Alliance Conference in just May 1983, just a few days ago. Quote, this is Helmut Schmidt, "We want the balance of military capabilities to be maintained. We saw that that balance endangered by the enormous buildup of the Soviet 55-20 missiles. I," says Schmidt, "I am responsible for the double-track decision as far as German participation goes, and I have not really changed my mind." As a matter of fact, Helmut Schmidt got into trouble politically because he was willing to stand upon that base. The Europeans, who are the leaders in European governments, notice how I'm defining this, those who have responsibility in European governments, understood the reality of what Winston Churchill said immediately after the last war. That is, that with the overwhelming forces of the Soviets, that they could easily dominate Western Europe to the Atlantic Ocean if it were not for the fact of being deterred by the United States having the atomic weapons. Now, please listen to this next sentence carefully. "We have come to a crazy place, undoubtedly, with much too much of the atomic weapons on both sides, and where there must be discussion and reduction concerning this." Fair enough. Of course there must be discussion concerning this. I'll repeat. "We have come to a crazy place, undoubtedly, with much too many of the atomic weapons on both sides, and where there must be open discussion and reduction concerning this. But the initial factor is not changed. Europe would even more today than in the days of Winston Churchill be subject to either military or political domination of the Soviets if it were not for the existence of the NATO atomic weapon. More today than in Winston Churchill's day. Further than this, Europe's atomic wealth, to the level that some European nations now have a higher standard of living than the United States, rests upon the fact that they are spending less for defense than they normally would have because of dependence on the atomic weapons the United States holds. As the Soviets, with their lack of care for the individuals in their nations, on the other hand, have used a larger proportion of their national income for building up their present great military machine, so that Western Europe has used less money for defense, and the Soviet bloc has used less money for their people and more to build up their machine at the expense of their economy. If the balance is now destroyed, there is no doubt in my mind that either militarily or through political blackmail. I'll just say here, add here, it's been my statement for years that the Soviet Union's dream of what they would wish to do is to totally dominate Western Europe without ever moving a soldier or firing a gun. Political blackmail. If you see that, some of the Western Europe's readers, leaders saying this kind of thing, that's what they mean. That the preponderance would be so great that there could be political blackmail. The greatly superior forces in Europe would soon overshadow Western Europe. It seems obtuse not to understand this when all the leaders of the European governments, from the conservatives to the socialists, including that socialist Willy Brandt, see the only hope of Europe having peace or not being under blackmail is to keep a balance in both conventional and atomic defense. Could go down a list from the extreme left to the right. There's not a European leader in responsible leadership in Europe today that doesn't say this very type of thing. As reported in the International Herald Tribune of April 20, 1982, Mr. Brandt, speaking of the peace movement, said that he feared, quote, the illusions which arise from being too far from reality, end of quote. He also said, quote, backing away from the NATO decision could give the Soviet Union an excuse for not negotiating seriously. That's no one less a person than Willy Brandt. Unilateral disarmament in this fallen world, and with the Soviets' materialistic base, would be totally utopian and romantic and lead, as utopians always do in a fallen world, to disaster. Further, it may sound reasonable to talk of a freeze at the present level, or, quote, we won't use the atomic weapons first. But thinking it through, either of these equals practical unilateral disarmament. The atomic deterrent is removed, and Europe stands at the absolute mercy of the overwhelmingly superior Soviet forces. And even if you don't think the Soviets have overwhelming superior forces throughout the whole world, I know of no one that doesn't agree that they have overwhelmingly superior forces in the Soviet theater, or in the European theater, sorry. The group at Harvard University, professors in their 1983 book, current book, Living with Nuclear Weapons is the title of the book, are correct when they point out, and listen with care please, quote, the danger of nuclear weapons lies in their use rather than their existence, end of quote. And it must never be forgotten that the freeze does not impose constraints on existing weapons. It's a flaw in that. It poses a freeze would impose nothing on existing weapons, nothing whatsoever. The world quite properly looks back to the church in Germany during the early days of Hitler's rise. And curses it for not doing something when something could have been done. Churchill said in the House of Commons after Chamberlain signed the Munich Pact, quote, the people should know that we have sustained a defeat without a war. They should know that we have passed an awful milestone in our history, and that the terrible words for the time being have been pronounced against the Western democracies. Thou art weighed in the balance and found wanting. And do not suppose this is the end. This is only the beginning of the reckoning. This is only the first sip, the first foretaste of a bitter cup that will be proffered to us year after year unless, by a supreme recovery of moral health and martial vigor, we rise again and take our stand for freedom as in olden times. That's what he said in the House of Commons when Chamberlain reported the signing of the Munich Pact. I do not always agree with the French political scientist, philosopher Jacques Ellul, but he certainly is correct when he writes in his book, False Presence in the Kingdom, quote, it was in 1930 that Christians should have alerted the world to decolonization, to Algeria and to Indochina. That was when the churches should have mobilized without let-up. By 1956, these matters no longer held any shadow of interest. The socio-political process was already in operation, and it could not make an iota of a difference whether Christians got into the act at once or not. It would have not lessened a single atrocity or resulted in a single act of justice. Likewise, in 1934, the occupation of the Ruhr, in 1935, the war in Abyssinia, the Christians should have foretold the inevitable war against Nazism. That was when clarity of vision was essential. After 1937, it was too late. The fate of the world was all settled for 30 years or more. Go on with his quote. But in those years, the Christians, full of good intentions, were thinking only of peace and were loudly proclaiming pacifism. In matters of that kind, Christians' good intentions are often disastrous. End of quote. One can understand that those who hold a liberal theology have being romantic in these matters, as they do not comprehend that the Bible is correct when it stresses that we live in a fallen world. We can understand that. I've said so many times in my writings and my lectures, liberal theology is only humanism expressed in theological terms rather than secular terms. So we're not surprised. One can also understand the so-called peace churches, the historic peace churches, holding to a pacifism as they have through the years, and they made a mistaken extension from Christ's command that each of us personally should turn the other cheek, just say none of us do enough, to the state not performing its God-meant duty of protecting the people and standing for justice in a fallen world. We can understand that. Both are understandable, though both in their own way are mistaken, and if they became the government position would be tragic. But when those who call themselves evangelicals begin to troop along in the popular, unthinking stream of our day and begin to be romantic and utopian, it is time to speak in open opposition. The May 30, 1983 Time magazine reports that the papal, that's May, just this last month, the May 30, 1983 Time magazine reports that the papal ambassador to Britain, Pronuncio Bruno Helm, wrote a letter about Monsignor Bruce Kent, another Roman Catholic leader, of course, wrote in a letter about Monsignor Bruce Kent, who heads the campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain, and, quote from the article, suggested that the Monsignor might be either an idiot or a conscious agent of the Soviet designs. And this is what he said in that situation. The latter is probably not the case. However, one does wonder if there is then any explanation, seeing as that's probably not the case, for the Monsignor and the others equally, speaking as they do, except on the basis of confused and deficient thought. I am convinced that if the Bible-believing people now go along with the concept of peace in our time under the plausible concern and fear of atomic warfare, which we all certainly feel, that our children and our grandchildren will curse us quite properly for not doing something at this moment to restrain the drift toward the loss to Western Europe and other places to Soviet expansion. It is not a bare theoretical concept. It means more of the world not only being under tyranny, which the Christians always should help people to resist, tyranny, from either side, right or left, but also means more of the world living in the horrible conditions of our dear brothers and sisters in Christ under the Soviet Union, with their not only lack of general freedom, but lack of freedom to teach even their own children about truth and about Christ. I do not want that for my children and for my grandchildren. And nothing in the Bible tells me that I should want that for my children, whether my physical children or my spiritual children. Nothing in the Bible tells me I should want that, either for my physical children and my grandchildren, or for my spiritual children, which are more numerous. The issue at this moment, I believe, is nothing less than Churchill versus Chamberlain. It is nothing less than the issue of Churchill versus Chamberlain. And remember all Jacques Ellul said. We stand with one or the other. In conclusion, the question comes down as to who really is for peace and who really is for war. That, I'm convinced, is the real question. And the conclusion on the base of the Bible's realism, and in the light of even recent history, is that those who say they are not for unilateral disarmament, but whose position equals unilateral disarmament, are those like Chamberlain who will bring war. And very highly, the possibility of not only other forms of war, but will bring atomic war. Yes, if anyone has questions, if you come up to the mic. Yes.
Time that you felt that it was important for y'all to live on the razor's edge and to not have too much financial security, for example. You felt that was important for y'all's faith, to not have a big bank account. And so there was a policy of giving money away rather than accumulating it whenever you were perhaps fortunate enough to have a lot of donations currently. There's a fellow here in Georgia that does a lot of financial counseling to Christians. I know a main theme that he deals with is getting rid of your comfort to live on the edge. Be willing to give away enough so that you're not sitting trusting your bank account.
I would want to break in. I don't say, I would want to, yes, I need this, don't I? I would want to break in and say, I don't say you shouldn't have any bank account. I should say, however, that each individual has to consider before the Lord how much money it's right for they individually to have, and be willing to show compassion in their use of accumulated wealth in helping others. Yes.
Would be a possible parallel in a Christian approach to dealing with the arms buildup, to maybe take some kind of a position that would say, we're willing to trust God a gap here, to be willing to take some kind of a limiting position which might at least force the Russians to show their hand where there may be a doubt.
I think what you're asking for is the same thing as saying for your own children that you should throw away all your food out of the icebox and say to your children, we'll just trust the Lord. I'm not
saying all the food out of the icebox. But I'm saying have a thinner icebox.
There is purely utopian to think that if we were so foolish as to have a unilateral freeze on this side of the Iron Curtain, that this would call forth, on the basis of their history and their worldview, the fact that they would retaliate in a positive way.
We wouldn't force them to show their hand, perhaps, a little
We
more.
wouldn't force them to show anything. It's purely romantic.
I'd like to ask you another thing. Would it not be with significance, perhaps, that apparently those forged Hitler papers had something in there where that apparently Russians wrote that stuff? They tried to make Chamberlain look good.
No, I don't think so. I'm sure lots of it watched us with real care, but I think it's turned out that it was just a pure fake for money. I don't think there was anything more subtle to it than this on Apple.
Even the part where they tried to make it look like Hitler respected the old Chamberlain?
I don't think, who can tell?
Yeah.
I'm not going to ever read them, this is obvious. But from all one can gather, I think it was just pure financial fraud. Yes, over here.
She was next.
That's all right, we go backward and forward.
Oh, okay.
If I don't forget.
In that case, would you go into some of the implications of what you said for Christians in an occupied country, perhaps participating in a resistance movement?
Yes, as I give in a Christian manifesto, our basic realization must be that the state does not have a right to command everything. There comes a place when a Christian must disobey the state. You remember the other night in the discussion, I went back to the early church and the early Christians disobeying the state in what was a civil matter and civil disobedience to the Roman state, and therefore they were killed. And I think anyone should know, if they think it through, that you cannot say to any sinful person, I will obey you no matter what you command. We have to, each person is a husband, wife, parent, child, et cetera, and certainly citizen state must disobey the state if the only choice is disobeying the state or disobeying God. Now, how to carry that out, as you remember I stressed the other night, must be considered upon the appropriate level. Here in this country, you remember if we were here when I stressed it, the courts, the appeal, electing the right people, we have all kinds of possibilities at the present time. But on the other hand, if you were in a certain situation, without any question, individual Christians might think that the only way to consistently operate would be on the basis of real disobedience, physical disobedience.
I really was thinking in terms of perhaps Christians' involvement in the French or Dutch resistance movements during World War II. believers actually resisting with force of arms.
Yeah, and if I'd been there, I'd have been with them, I must say. I went to Holland for the first time in 1947, and I visited a lot of these leaders of the resistance movement in Holland, and I was very intrigued. You can ask the Dutch people, they're here. But what I found out was that overwhelmingly it was the Bible-believing people of Holland that were in the resistance movement, not the liberals, not that there were none there. Same thing was true of Hallesby, Professor Hallesby in Norway. He was the leader, it wasn't the liberal bishop. And I would say I think they're right, because you see, the basic proposition would be that in a certain case, let's say in the Germans occupying Holland, they were not the proper authority. They had usurped the authority. The government of the loyal Dutch was in England, with the Queen, where the Queen was. Therefore, this was a people who were imposing something on the poor Dutch that really they had no right to impose. And as such, I honor the Dutch very highly for what they did in the resistance movement. I really do. The French resistance movement is more mixed as history goes on and we see it. Not that there wasn't a lot of courage there, but it was mixed. But the Dutch resistance movement and the Norwegian resistance movement, for example, was pretty clear-cut, I would say. In such a case, of course, I have to add another note. No one has a right in any of these things to lay anything on somebody else. You must know what the Holy Spirit wants you to do. Everybody should think through the principle, and that is whether it's husband and wife, parent, child, church officer, or church member, or state and a citizen, that a Christian, and there's a principle, a final principle which we all should hold, the realization that you must disobey any of these offices if they command that which is contrary to the Word of God. But the form it should take must be the individual leading of the Holy Spirit to the individual. We mustn't lay guilt trips on each other. So I could visualize two brothers in a Dutch family. One would join the resistance movement, one wouldn't. Both looking to the Lord. I could visualize that very loudly. But having said that, I honor those who were willing to put their life on the line so that Holland could be free from not only the killing of the Jews, which we hear a lot about, but the terrible persecution of the Dutch as the Dutch, with all that is involved. And after all, if the Germans had been able to consolidate their power, those that I'm closest to in Holland, who are the Bible-believing Christians, would have been squashed in the concentration camps as much as the Jews or anybody else. This is exactly what Jacques Ellul is talking about. On the other hand, I would finally repeat, no one has a right to lay a guilt trip on somebody else. You must, just as I answered over here about the amount of money you should have in a bank. We're all called for a compassionate use of accumulated wealth. There's no way for a church session or anybody else to say you can have so many thousand in the bank and not so much. We all should have a compassionate use of our wealth, first in how we make our money, and secondly, how we use it. But no one has a right to lay on another Christian what that means in the amount of bank accounts. Now, it's exactly the same, I would say, here. If I was in Poland today, if I was a Christian in Poland, what would I do? I have no way to say. I'm not in Poland. I don't know the situation. Yes, over here.
Dr. Schaeffer, would you please give a couple historical examples of when you said utopias always turn out badly? I guess my education's lacking in that area.
Yeah, it would be in every area. For the example, the people during when the Industrial Revolution began to arise in England, and they thought if they could only smash the means of industry and get back to the quote-unquote simple life, everything would be beautiful. Of course, it wasn't at all. The problem wasn't the Industrial Revolution, it was the abuses of it. Gandhi, totally utopian. Totally utopian. The film Gandhi is really an overwhelmingly sellout. Gandhi was operative all right when you were standing against the British at that point of their empire. But immediately after the British left, his ideas of utopianism are going back to the spinning wheel and everybody back to the village. Nobody in India follows his example. It led to total confusion and ugliness. I feel, as Jacques Ellul said in this quote, of the Christians who were busy following pacifism prior to the First World War. This was a utopianism, and undoubtedly it led to the war. Total tragedy. The communes in this country, there's a difference between community and commune in my definitions. Labri is a community. It's not a commune, according to the definition that often is used anyway. A commune would be where everybody has everything in common. Everything in common. Children, as well as wealth. Completely turned inward. Now maybe there's a commune somewhere as opposed to a community that is functioning well, but I don't know any. It brings forth ugliness because it isn't realistic about a fallen world. You could go down through a lot of other examples. You can pick any place where people in a fallen world act toward the perfectibility of man, because that's what's really involved. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, before the French Revolution, put forth the concept of the perfectibility of man, that if you could just get man rid of his chains, and he was thinking of cultural chains, man would be good. The French Revolution came along, followed out the pattern, and of course there was the guillotine. And I would just say that, and then the Russian Revolution is a utopianism in theory, as it was presented. And that is that man is perfectible. Man is perfectible, and if you just get rid of his economic chains, man will be good. And if you get confused about the news reports of Anatov as he's speaking recently, he says we're on our way toward communism, and you may say they are communistic. Not in their definition. In their definition, they're socialistic because the people aren't yet ready to be communistic, in which everybody would have everything in common with no external boundaries. That may have sounded great 50, 60 years ago, but it has led to the greatest totalitarian state that probably the world has ever known, or one of the greatest. Total utopianism. Instead of leading toward man being perfectible in the Soviet Union, it has led to total totalitarianism and oppression. All these things, where are you who asked the question? Yeah, all these things are utopianisms. I could go on for another hour. But I just flatly, anybody who has an idea that some small thing, and I'm going to say this, and don't anybody laugh because I'm being deadly serious. The nudists at the end of the last century in England were absolutely convinced that if everybody took off their clothes, there wouldn't be any more problems. But don't laugh, because they were serious. Of course it didn't work. We live in a fallen world. We live in a fallen world. So anytime, we as Bible-believing Christians, we say the fall is historic. The first chapters of Genesis are historic. We live in a fallen world. The liberal theologian doesn't believe in a fall. But I think a great number of the troubles of our confusion of thinking in regard to health, in regard to many other things, comes because though we stand clearly theologically for the fact we live in a fallen world, we don't have the mentality of looking at the world consistently as though it were fallen. Tremendous freedom in all kinds of areas of thinking and life if you really take seriously that we live in a fallen world. And this is the very contrast, of course, to the perfectibility of man. What I would just say, the liberation theology in South America, this, like many terms, is a spectrum. You have to define who you're talking about. But the real liberation theology in South America, coupled with liberal theology, believes in the perfectibility of man. It doesn't lead to something beautiful in these countries. It's a tragedy. Yes.
In relationship to our rhetoric on abortion, we often use the illustrations of the silent Holocaust, and in relationship to the ovens that the Germans used to bake the Jewish population. And I have somewhat of an emotional and intellectual struggle with what our reaction is today to the abortion issue. We say that it's murder, and we prove it to our own belief anyway that it is murder, and we open up the paper and see it advertised, and we look across the table at our wife and we say, oh, it's terrible, isn't it? It seems like if we related it to our own personal responsibility, and if we truly believed it, it seems like our actions regarding it belie the depth of how deep we really believe it. And my question is, how in the world do we resolve the issue that in a state like Georgia, there's a number of abortions going on at this very moment, and we say, well, if they were baking people, we would go down and pull the plugs or do whatever else. How emotionally and intellectually can we rationalize not doing something physical?
Well, of course, we should be doing something, and incidentally, of course, we say it is murder. Now, it's an interesting factor. We're dealing with words. Murder means that legally it is murder. The Supreme Court has says it isn't. But nevertheless, it is the killing of human life. And we should be emotionally stirred. I am emotionally stirred that so few Christians seem emotionally stirred. Now, that you must be careful here, because we can't say that the Christians are doing nothing, because I'm sure there are doctors and nurses in this audience who have paid a tremendous price to do something about abortion. Founding of abortion clinics, etc., but also refusing to serve in hospitals where there are abortions at the loss of professional advancement. Nurses I know that have been fired because they refuse to allow that little sign to deter them when it says do not feed, and the baby's being starved to death, and they feed the baby, and they've gotten into trouble. So it would be unfair to say nobody's doing anything, but emotionally to me is the factor that we certainly should be moved that the Christians haven't done what they should do. A very clear illustration, when we were starting with the seminars after the making of the film and the doing of the book, or whatever happened to the human race, we went around, I just say, to make the picture clear, the gospel films who released both of these films made a bucket full of money on how should we then live seminars. When the Whatever Happened to the Human Race began, Frankie's little company, with the courage he's had for all these issues, thought that they also would be able to carry the thing fairly easily. Instead of that, the seminars were a tremendous success, both in this country and in Britain, in the sense that people were stirred. People went out of that, and there's been a difference. Before that time, the whole issue was being lost because it was just called a Roman Catholic issue. Today, that isn't the case. There are probably more Bible-believing Christians in the evangelical Protestant side in the anti-abortion thing than Roman Catholics in some places. In Britain, something I'd ask you to pray for. I'm flying out of here on Friday night, fly the ocean, go right from Gatwick practically to an anti-abortion rally we're having in Hyde Park. They expect 100,000 there. You pray for me, because flying the ocean going, it's going to be hard. But the point is, when we went to Britain, first of all, with the seminars, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, I think the British people here will totally agree there was practically no voice against abortion. Not none, but practically none. Today, that isn't so. So it isn't that nothing is being done. But still, the thing which intrigued us was that those seminars were not so well attended, even though they were colossal success, to the praise of God, by the time they were finished. But they were not so well attended. Why? Because the evangelicals didn't urge their people to come. And not only that, I'll say with tears, that we knew places where there were evangelical churches and organizations that planned other meetings so their people couldn't come. Why? They didn't want their boat robbed. They didn't want their boat robbed. So it's better today, but it isn't all it should be. Now, as far as physical violence, I would just say every individual has to decide for himself what the Holy Spirit leads him to do. But the important thing is to do things in a way that is the appropriate level, as I stress in a Christian manifesto. I was impressed on the thing we did down here in the memorial service last Saturday, with the dignity of it, and so on. I think that at our present moment is the appropriate level. However, somebody may feel differently. But that is the appropriate level. On the other hand, to be silent and not to speak at a memorial service like that would certainly be entirely wrong. So I would say, where are you, the person? Yes. I would just say each person has to determine, and for themselves, what the Lord wants them to do. And most of all, we must be careful not just to grow lax about this thing and forget what has occurred. But we must do it on the appropriate level. If you're too shrill If you're too, and that doesn't mean not picketing abortion clinics necessarily. If that's what people are led to do, that should be done. Always with the Christian alternatives on the other side of a point of struggling and fighting like mad for crisis pregnancy centers. But in Florida, for example, a young man I know very well had a picketing of the abortion clinic in Florida. He was arrested, and there was a trial, and he won his case. That's a great step forward. We owe Jean Edmond, and Frankie was down there with him, we owe Jean Edmond a great vote of thanks, because we've set a precedent that you have a right to exert your freedom of speech to say this is the killing of human life. As I said, I'm going to give a talk on this whole thing later in the week, not the practical aspects of it, but abortion is abortion. Yes?
Turning back to a passage it seems that Americans are still smarting from the Vietnam experience, where the intention, as I understood it, was to prevent South Vietnam from being opposed by North Vietnam or being oppressed by North Vietnam. The attitude is still extremely negative. Veterans are not honored, but struggle with the shame of having been involved in the war. The U.S. is basically scarred from the experience. How do people that are strongly opposed to this kind of involvement in another country respond to your message, and how do you respond to their desire for non-involvement in another country in the face of this bad experience in Vietnam?
We went through the Vietnam thing in Labri, of course, with the chapel Saturday nights always filled with people who had different opinions. And all that period you had to say, well, the Vietnam situation was an unclear situation and Christians differed. But you do have something to remember in the situation, regardless of one might think about the practicability. Notice what my word now, the practicability of involvement there. And that is, there would have been no boat people. And there would have been no Cambodia if the North Vietnamese had not won the war. There would have been none. And even if you still have problems, you've got to face this fact. This is a result. This is what I'm talking about, loving your neighbor as yourself. There's no use weeping about these boat people drowning, thousands, millions of the Cambodians being killed by their own government. There's no use weeping about this without the recognition of who's doing the killing. It was the North Vietnamese that have moved in, taken over the country, and done the killing. So therefore, what I would say, the situation in Vietnam, highly, open to much discussion. Whether you can fight a limited war in a day like ours, big question. Whether it wasn't practical, because you do have to face the fact that you can't right all the wrongs in the world, either individually or governmentally. You have to make your choices. You can't do everything. But when it's all over, if the country is going to turn inward because of this, and it's clear that this is passing, if they're going to turn inward and say we'll just give away one thing after another, it's not only a problem of principle, but it's a pragmatic problem too. You can't give away everything and be safe. These people are going to be brought up short if it went on in its logical consistency of their own position. And someone may say here, why should we bother with Europe? After all, Europe is this vastly expanded earning power, and we read that they're not spending enough money for their own defense, depending upon us, and then they curse us when we try to help them. Why should we bother? Well, but nevertheless, we should love these people. We shouldn't want that whole Western Europe to be under what Poland is under today. We have a responsibility. But if you didn't give a hoop for principle, which is no Christian should fail to have a concern. Western Europe is very close to us, not only geographically, but culturally, and all the other ways. Now, but if you didn't give a hoop of principle, but only pragmatically, using that word, well, good is a good word now, and for your own good, You can't give away Europe and the United States not be effective. You can't do it. What are you going to give away next? South America? What happens when it's Mexico? So consequently, I would just say, in a fallen world, you have to be realistic. You can't do everything. You do what you can do, and people are going down through history to have differences about the Vietnam War, but it ought to be looked at very clearly. I admire Joan that's right, Baez, very much. She was against the Vietnam War. I doubt, never mind whether she was right or wrong in that. But as soon as the Vietnamese came in and started to kill the Cambodians, she spoke out just as clearly against Vietnam. Jane Fonda, for example, and her husband, Hayden, isn't that his name, issued a statement, we should never speak out against a socialistic government no matter what. Just let me out of here. So I would admire her, even though regardless of what we think of the first proposition, at least she's trying to be even-handed. But this other thing isn't even-handed at all. Even-handed, it shows a complete commitment before the discussion begins. And it was shameful the way the Vietnam veterans were treated. No doubt about this. I'm glad for their monument in Washington now, regardless of what I think about the war. But because they fought for their country, as much, in their view, as much as any other war. Even if the government happened to be wrong, if one thinks it is, and I'm not saying what I think. But I would just say you have to recognize that you cannot right all the wrongs in the world any more than we individually as Christians or as a church or Labri can evangelize everybody in the world. We're limited by our finiteness in money, energy, and time. We can't feed everybody in the world. And the first gentleman who was at the microphone tied this in properly to the use of wealth. You can't feed everybody in the world. That doesn't remove the responsibility of loving your neighbor as yourself up to the level where you can. And I think that ties in with this. Now, the United States, I remember when I was in school, I was always taught America's never lost a war. Terrific. Now we've lost one. So Americans being Americans, anybody I guess, but Americans being Americans, this isn't very easy to take, and we have to face the fact. But on the other hand, to retreat into a real setting of thinking we can live on our own island, it would have been stupid in the First World War. To think we can do it in the second, this time of history, is just plain really blind. So I would just say, of course we face these problems. But having said that, you have to think of principle first and then move to what can be done with a recognition that the loss of Western Europe, which is the next move on the board, undoubtedly, if it would be possible, from the other side. The loss of Western Europe would not only be a matter, as I see it, of a deserting principle of loving my neighbor as myself, but also pragmatically, it would be a titanic loss. Yes.
In discussing the issue of nuclear weapons with others, a question has come up: is it right to kill another person for the sake of one's rights, with the idea that it is selfish to demand one's rights over another person's life? How would you respond to this?
I would respond to it that if you take the historic peace churches that I've mentioned, I honor them very highly, and many of them are my personal friends. What they have said is that you take Jesus' words, you should turn the other cheek. And I said in my talk in the way past, as you notice, none of us turn the other cheek enough. None of us. There isn't a single one in this room who in the last 48 hours has turned the other cheek enough, without any question. But the discussion must continue whether Jesus teaching us personally to turn the other cheek then includes turning the other cheek when other people are involved. That's really the discussion. The illustration I used of the little child being beaten to death. If I was beaten to death, if I were beaten to death, that would be one thing. But if somebody else is being beaten to death, that's quite another thing. And then when you extend it further beyond the personal application to the government's responsibility of maintaining justice for its people, would it be the government's proper function to allow the Russians come in and just allow them come in and welcome them when we know what it would result in? So you have to be very careful here, because none of us turn the other cheek enough, and we love to grab hold of these things and use an excuse of not turning the other cheek. And I repeat, within the 48 hours, the last 48 hours, none of us in this room have turned the other cheek consistently. But should there be the extension when somebody else is involved? This is what I think is the question. And you never want to kill anybody. No Christian ought to do anything except weep in these situations. And I always said, during the last World War, I was a pastor in this country, and I always talked to a boy when he was going into the war next to the last of his parents. His parents talk last, but I talk next to last as pastor, because I've always been close to my people. And what I would always say to them as I talked to them as they went away to war, that just because they had a uniform on didn't mean they couldn't commit murder if they got caught up and enjoyed the kill. So even in a just war, and I think that's proper terminology, even in a just war where with weeping you have to do this, in loving your neighbor as yourself, you don't want to do it. And you could still sin if you then did it with pleasure. Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't want to kill anybody. But I don't want to, no, you may see this as a silly analogy, but I mean it. I hated to spank my children. Now, that doesn't mean sometimes I didn't lose my temper and do it in a temper, and then I had to say I was sorry. But nevertheless, just because I hated to didn't mean that there didn't come a rare occasion when they, in later years, and I then realized it was for their best good. I didn't enjoy it, except when I was in a sinful, egoistic mood, and so mad I blew my top, which I did too, incidentally, same as some of you. But I don't think the analogy is false. Do you see what I'm saying? There's lots of things in this world I don't like. If I was a surgeon, I wouldn't like to perform the kind of operation somebody we should pray for in Minneapolis. A girl had a terrible operation to straighten her spine, and she's in horrible agony now, and Edith and I are agonizing for her up in that hospital. Please pray for her. If I was that surgeon, I wouldn't enjoy that operation and the pain I was causing. Do you see what in a foreign world, lots of things are like this. Yes.
I wonder, would you make some comments concerning communicating the ideas that you've expressed concerning abortion, concerning freedom in our country and around the world, national defense, what have you? Most of us, I feel, here are lay people. I haven't necessarily experienced it here, but many times the folk with whom we meet, there's a great sense of despondency that nothing can happen. You know, the pastor won't do this, the church elders won't do that, or whatever the church officers may be. Would you have any comments to make as to how to communicate some of these ideas that our tribe may increase, if you will?
Were you here Saturday night when I spoke? Well, I think the thing isn't just bits and pieces. It's a matter of mentality in these things. Whether we give in an accommodation along the line by a mental, as I use the term, knee-jerk reaction, or whether we realize and especially give in because we really don't want to rock the boat of our own projects. Really, that's often, unhappily, it isn't any better than this. Or because we caught with a false view of spirituality, that it's unspiritual to get involved in all these things. You remember how I developed that on Saturday night. And I think we have to start back there with the people who are in leadership in our groups. And that is to realize that truth does bring confrontation. And if we really believe it's true, it's more or less tied in with what this gentleman said over here. At some place you're stirred to do something that you wouldn't want to do. Truth does bring its right level of confrontation, but it's going to bring confrontation, and it's going to take the willingness to rock the boat on the projects. There's no doubt about it. The reason those churches didn't support the seminars, whatever happened to human race, is that they didn't want the boat rocked. They were afraid it would hurt them some way or another in their own little projects. So I think we have to start back there and really wrestle through and realize there's this long history of accommodation. And of course the other side of the coin is there's so much confrontation which has been so ugly that it turns us off. So you've got to say it's got to be loving confrontation, but confrontation. Then after one works on this mentality, and you can't change a mentality overnight, then I think, or speaking against a poor view of spirituality, then I think the next thing to do is the practical aspects of what can our individual group do, what really is possible, and always stressing the Christian alternatives along with the the other action. Now then, in the individual church would feel differently. Undoubtedly, some individual church would feel more called to start a crisis pregnancy. Some of them would start more called to deal with helping the aged as they come to the end of their life, a hospice sort of a situation. So I would move first into the area of principle, of insisting that the Lordship of Christ is over the totality of life. And that we must realize that if we say a thing is true, it does bring confrontation. I deal with this. And then secondly, the individual group ought to determine under the leadership of the Lord what they can do within their resources. And the resources, I'm not just thinking of physical resources, but time and energy. It costs something to help a family who has one more child and doesn't have it aborted. If that child is ill and needs care, for the church to visit and take care, the aged, after the church sharing in the burden. But to move from the principle into the second thing of after the principle of then really trying to build up with that specific group, specific programs that are within the possibilities of the group. But choose something that is reasonable to start on. You don't expect a baby to be a weightlifter. And choose what's possible in the practical realm and start to apply your energy in this regard. Now, can anybody tell me when this is supposed to end? 4 or 5 minutes? Okay. I'm sorry, I'll just take one more then.
I don't know if my question is redundant in light of the last one or an extension of it, but I've been pondering your ideas about disobedience, appropriate disobedience. What is the proper response of a Christian when his denomination stands as a denomination for a wrong view? I'm thinking specifically of the vote in the Presbyterian denomination, which was my denomination previously, last month, reaffirming their very strong position favoring abortion and wrong views on genetic engineering and other matters in biomedical ethics.
I would say whether it's theological wrong views or whether it's practical wrong views which are the result of theological wrong views. Because that's why the reason these denominations are taking the wrong views in abortion and all these other questions is the factor of the dominance of liberal theology in the denominations. Now, I would say that we must say they're wrong, either in the theological side or the practical side, and that at a certain place, I believe, for myself, I couldn't belong to a denomination in this situation. But, now comes the but it must be under the individual leadership of the Holy Spirit again. I can't tell you what you should do at this existential moment. But I'll just say this to you very gently. I could not belong to a denomination that if it was totally controlled without possibility of cleansing, notice that phrase very carefully, from liberal theology. And I couldn't belong and have my name used by a denomination that came out foursquare for abortion. I just couldn't. Now, you have to determine what you can do. But I couldn't. I couldn't live with it as what I would feel for me to be honoring my Lord with what I think the issues are. I would repeat, the reason these denominations take the views they take about abortion and homosexuality, these other matters, The reason these views are held is because these are the extent to which a liberal theology dominates, and therefore the scriptures are no longer the standard. So I feel for you all who are caught in this, and I wouldn't tell you what to do. I don't care whether it's in personal matters or in this kind of matter, I very carefully always try very clearly to make plain, I'm not the Holy Spirit to anybody. I just am not. I just am not. But in matters of principle, in measuring up to the Scriptures, I'm quite willing to speak, because this is not subjective under the leadership of the Holy Spirit at all. It is objective according to the Word of God. And one of the great horrible things is, you see, that we move and we move and we move. And the denominations become more and more dominated with liberal theology, certain ones, not all, happily, by any means. And as they are, let me repeat what I've said so often. Liberal theology is only humanism using theological terms rather than secular terms. And for this reason, you know from before it occurs that those who are controlled with this thinking will always come down eventually on the same side as secular humanism. Always. It's an absolute certainty. So when these denominations take the awful position they take about abortion, I'm torn with tears. But simultaneously, I am never surprised. It never takes me by surprise. I think in conclusion, if I can, I talked about a poor view of spirituality that leads the two reasons groups aren't as active as they should be. The wrong view of spirituality, and then on the second thing of not wanting to rock their own boat on their own projects. I think maybe the thing to say as I conclude here is if it's a wrong view of spirituality that has made the tragedy in certain cases that it has, what's the true view of spirituality as I would see it from the Bible? And as I would see true spirituality, it runs like this. And this will touch upon many of the subjects you'll hear being discussed here. The true spirituality runs like this, that here is God, and not all things are the same to him. He has a character, and things either conform to his character or they don't. And he has graciously told us in the Bible what conforms to his character. He's graciously told us. Now then, the things that don't conform to his character are sin. And the Bible tells us what things are sin. So think of these things that are sin in an oblong, like this. Put all the things the Bible says are sin because they're contrary to the character of God in this oblong. Now, after you put them in the oblong, take and put that oblong aside. Now, none of us do this in our lives because we're all sinners. None of us are perfect. We won't be till Jesus comes. So I'm not saying then we have actually put them aside, but think for a moment and just visually put them aside. Then what is true spirituality? Well, from the biblical teaching, everything else in life is spiritual. Absolutely everything. And not only that, I'll be stronger. Everything else is equally spiritual. Jesus is the Lord of all. Jesus is the Lord of all. The things that are sinful are a rebellion against him. Of course, these are unspiritual. But the rest of life belongs to the Lord Jesus. And these things, the rest of life is spiritual. Now, if we really grasp this fact, then we will have different leadings as to the practice of our spirituality. But nevertheless, we must recognize that we mustn't allow our spirituality to be something up here, something that I would call Platonic, something like this. That isn't true. True spirituality is the Lord Jesus Christ, who has become my Savior and saved me from hell, being the Lord of my life, in the totality of life, and the realization that everything is equally spiritual when brought under his lordship and under the Scriptures. And this is imperative if we're going to have a true spirituality that'll really give Christ the honor and the glory, rather than a truncated spirituality that separates us from the realities of life. Thank you.